Hello, welcome to the Tech for Good podcast. We are very passionate about two things, technology and our world. In each pod, we will be interviewing some fascinating people, business leaders, but those with a special interest in solving the biggest issues facing humanity today. Think the environment, think healthcare provision during a pandemic, think global social injustice. If you want to know more about technology's immense potential to fix and transform, then you're in the right place. In this episode, Stuart Hodge speaks to Rudolf Gordon-Seymour. Rudolf is head of international fundraising for Télécoms Sans Frontières, an NGO which sets up emergency communications networks during humanitarian crises. Its work is vital in supporting populations which are often in critical need. In the interview, Rudolf talks in detail about TSF's work, along with the challenges and the rewards. But first, Stuart asks Rudolf to give a potted history of the company itself.
Basically, TSF was formed in 1998 by Jean-François Cazeneuve and Monique Lane-Petit. They were doing kind of traditional humanitarian work back in the 90s during the Balkans crisis. And it became really apparent at that time when they were being handed notes from people wishing to speak to their loved ones and family. So they would be handing these notes to them saying, please, can you try and contact my father, my mother, or my child? And at that point, they felt there was this kind of missing link in the kind of NGO world. And technology and communications were obviously becoming more and more important at that time. And they created Télécoms Sans Frontières off the back of that.
That does sound like a really sort of emotional thing, that, you know, like speaking to people in war zones and just not being able to contact the people you love. I can definitely see why that motivation was kind of there. And what about your own journey then? So tell me how you got to the point of where you are now and your own sort of career history a wee bit.
Well, it's going back a little bit, and I'll be showing my age a bit. I fell into telecoms really after university. Literally, kind of fell in 1995, and back in the good old days of X25 and V24 modems, which I think were kind of kicking out about 19.2k speeds at that time, which was unheard of. So that's where I started. And I started for an American network provider called Infinet Corporation, which was subsequently bought by British Telecom, funnily enough. And I started in the global support world, supporting financial networks. And so it was a real kind of baptism of fire from student life, being put into this crazy world of technical support for dealers in financial houses.
Granted, but the 1990s, an exciting time to be involved in the sector, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, it was a roller coaster for sure. From 95 to 2005 was a real roller coaster, because obviously we saw the .com, the rise of the .com and the fall of the .com.
And the crash, yeah.
And I left Infinet after 5 years and joined what was a small startup at the time, based in London, called European Telecommunications. So we were really kind of riding that storm at the time, during that kind of mini crisis, but we managed to come out of that, and that grew and grew through mergers, acquisitions, and organic growth to become GTT Communications. And I worked for them for 14, 15 years.
Okay, and then so what about the Télécoms Sans Frontières step of the journey?
Well, after a great period with GTT Communications, which I headed up the global operations for, I decided to kind of take a back step and take a sabbatical. Basically, I'd kind of moved around a bit, lived in 3 or 4 different countries, and it was kind of full on role, 24/7. Operations is always
Yeah.
you never turn your phone off. So I decided to take some time out, and I really like the idea of working for an NGO, but I wanted to work for an NGO where I could kind of use my experience and my skill set to actually add kind of hopefully real value to that. And I literally, being based in the south of France, I happen to be and live 15 minutes from Télécoms Sans Frontières HQ. And I happened to bump in to the founder of TSF by sheer chance. We had a conversation, and I said, well, I've got some time and I'd really like to kind of be a part of, the great work that you do.
Tell us a bit about that conversation, because I think it's really interesting how life can be serendipitous at times like that, like where things just happen. Because I mean, obviously it's the time where you're kind of looking for something new, something where your skills are relevant, and then you end up bumping in, that conversation ends up happening. So tell us a wee bit about that.
It was incredibly random. Two French people turned up at my house one morning, inviting me to a lunch, which was all to do about the history of the house that I was living in. So they invited me to lunch, and I thought, well, it would seem fitting that I should invite them for a coffee morning before we go to lunch. So 2 weeks later, I had 25 people turn up for coffee.
By the way, for anyone that doesn't know, this is obviously just showing, Rudolf, that you've got a keen understanding of French culture when it comes to the expectations that are there. Having lived in France myself, I know that they know how to do coffee mornings and lunches very well.
I know what's important to them, that's for sure. So I had 25 people at the house, and one of those people was Jean-Francois, who was the founder of TSF, and weirdly enough, his connection was to my house because his grandfather used to own my house.
Wow!
So as a child, he used to play in the garden in the house. So it was the most random meeting, and I said, well, we should talk. So we did, and almost 3 years later, here I am.
So what's been the sort of proudest moment so far for you in your time working with TSF? Is there any one sort of moment or kind of case study you could mention that has given you real pride from the work that you've done?
Well, TSF, the organisation, the people who work here, they're a real kind of modest bunch, yeah. So we don't like to use the word kind of proud. I don't think. I think the achievement, from my point of view, I'm all about funding, and that funding obviously will help support the actual global operations that we carry out. Yeah. So I'm kind of a little bit detached from the real world of TSF in terms of the engineering deployments. But all I know is every time I get funding or a new partner, I know that is going to support our emergency deployments or could be channeled into our long-term programs. And so for me, that's enough, and I'm very happy when we can kind of grow that funding stream.
So tell me a bit, let's get into the nitty-gritty of it. Tell me the kind of stuff that TSF does and some of the quite extreme cases of the work that you do, some of the real difficult stuff, if you like.
Well, I think, over their history since 1998, TSF have carried out over 140 deployments across over 70 countries. Yeah.
Wow.
So in that time, they have supported over 20 million beneficiaries and nearly 1,000 NGOs as well, because we don't just deploy to support displaced populations in a natural disaster scenario, but we're also on the ground to help support other local responders and NGOs so they can also coordinate their work, because communication is absolutely vital on the ground. So I think every deployment's a challenge. I think it would be very difficult to kind of pick one out of the 140, but I mean, if I was to kind of look back at my time here, I know during 2019 there was Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas, and that kind of brought a new set of challenges in terms of aid getting to the affected islands, of which there were many, and also moving between the islands because it was still quite stormy conditions. So, there was a high risk of injury to personnel. And also when the teams deploy on the ground, they've also got to look after themselves as well. I mean, we do as much kind of pre-assessment work as we can, but we're trying to dispatch a team within 24 hours. There's not a lot of time for a big assessment report at that stage. So actually, most of the assessment is done in the first week on the ground. So they've also got to look after themselves. So they've got to kind of feed themselves and shelter themselves. Yeah. So we have had engineers, sleeping on supermarket floors. Yeah.
Wow.
Whilst still trying to put together a communication network for the affected population. So, those guys are the real heroes of Télécoms Sans Frontières.
Hello, I'm Daniel Brigham, editor of Tech for Good magazine. I hope you're enjoying this podcast, and if you want more, you can head over to techforgood.net for some compelling and thought-provoking stories. From high-tech insect farms that could solve world hunger to a global mission to counter the spread of COVID-19 disinformation, we've got Tech for Good covered. You can read and subscribe at techforgood.net.
What are the kind of biggest challenges that are faced? Maybe by some of these people that you guys have had to confront, and then in your role as well, what's the biggest challenge you face in terms of managing to generate enough funding to go out there and be able to do this very valuable job?
Well, I think getting people on board and understanding what we do. I mean, the understanding what we do is really easy. Everyone kind of gets it in the industry, in the telecom tech industry. I think the challenge is actually speaking to the right people in order to have those conversations, because anything to do with CSR or ESG is decided at the top of the organization, and it's a culture of the organization. So it really comes down from CEO board level. Yeah. So we have to be getting in front of the key decision makers in the organization, and they have to have an appetite for CSR. And my job is to kind of engage with mainly kind of C-level personnel within those organizations, and look to see how they can help us on lots of different levels, including funding, but also to kind of confirm a link between their CSR program and what we do, because we can be kind of an extension of their kind of marketing message. Because we're a communications driven NGO. So we have to be quick, we have to be agile, we have to be responsive. We hit all those kind of key areas of a lot of the telecom tech companies.
The obvious question to ask at this point, and unfortunately it's one that you ask in just about every interview now, is how has COVID-19 affected things for you guys? I mean, has it made it even more difficult to do deployments? And what about from a sort of holistic standpoint as an organization? How has it affected you guys?
Well, I think it's COVID. I think it's affected every organisation at different levels, and Télécoms Sans Frontières are no different to that. The kind of immediate impact to us was actually looking at some of our current long-term programs and having to adapt those. So, for instance, we for a number of years we've been running education centres in Turkey for Syrian children. So these are the child refugees from the Syrian war that are now kind of based in Turkey, and an entire kind of missed generation in terms of education and schooling.
Yeah, it's so sad.
So what we've had to do there is we've had to then provide a distance learning option and alternative, because we couldn't have them all in a class-based education program. So we've had to kind of move them out of the classroom. So that was one of the first things we did in the first few months when this kicked off. And this, we're talking about, almost a year ago now, when this actually kicked off and hit Western Europe. So again, in South America, we provide information centers for migrants who are traveling through Mexico. Again, we've adapted those to provide information on COVID. Originally, they were there to provide information on the legal rights for asylum and for entering new countries. So we've kind of adapted that. And also in Syria, where we've connected lots of medical facilities, we've expanded those connections in Syria for the medical facilities, because obviously they're already overrun. Even without COVID, they're under incredible pressure. So if you add COVID into that equation, it becomes, almost unmanageable.
So what I'm kind of, you're saying all these things here, and I'm just sitting going, that must be really hard to encounter on a daily basis. Like the work is obviously hugely valuable, but having to face up to the realities of some of the most horrible things, some of the most horrible situations people find themselves in the world, is that not a real challenge sometimes, looking and dealing with some of these things and being aware of them?
Yeah, I think it's hugely challenging, but I think as an organization, we're very focused in terms of identifying the immediate needs, whether it be on a emergency deployment or a longer term program. And we can adapt to that, and we're a very innovative organization. So we really use technology for the greater good.
Yeah, well, that's what we are. We're about tech for good. So do you have any kind of cool examples of where you've been innovative?
Well, I think if I was to kind of look recently, because we've had multiple deployments during this COVID crisis, and back in September, we had to deploy to Beirut because of the multiple port explosions down there, which impacted over 300,000 people, those explosions. So we actually set up quite an innovative call center, actually, where the displaced population using WhatsApp could actually message, which would then go to the call center and turn that into a case that needed to be followed up. So we used a WhatsApp bot.
Wow.
So these are some of the kind of innovations, and the reason they used WhatsApp, because we looked to see what was the most popular messaging platform in that region.
Yeah. No, that makes total sense.
In that region, it happened to be WhatsApp. And obviously, we know everyone, even in the developing economies, most people have mobile phones. So we can use that to our advantage, and that's what we've done in Beirut, and provided a lot of support to people who are homeless, who've got financial issues, and that emergency deployment actually turned into a long-term deployment, because we are still there and still supporting the affected population, and now it's become more of a psychological need requirement.
Do you want to keep up to date with the latest in enterprise, technology, and digital transformation? Visit digitalbulletin.com for news, long reads, thought leadership, and so much more. That's digitalbulletin.com.
It must be hugely rewarding, the work you do and the work that the whole team does.
Yeah, and before our interview, I did canvass some of the engineering team and said to them, so was the most rewarding part. And the theme that really came out was actually seeing these affected populations on the ground and seeing them smile, because we've just provided this means of communication which has had such a huge impact, stuff we take for granted every day. It's had just a huge impact on them during really difficult times. So I think our reward is a smile and a happy person at the end of what we do. And I think when people see the TSF logo on the ground, I think their kind of feeling is very positive in terms of, great, we're going to be able to get in communication with our family.
The literature I had a look at in the build up to this interview was one of the projects you guys have got called Lab for Future. It's the one I think you might have referenced it earlier for the Syrian refugees in Turkey. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about that in detail, because I think that sounds like an example of one of the really interesting projects where you've gone sort of one step beyond just ABC and an abacus,
Yeah, no, it's really Lab for Future, which we started last year, is really an extension of our kind of education program. And basically, it's directed initially for Syrian refugee children based in Turkey. And there's over 400,000 children from Syria and Turkey, who basically don't have any means of education. So we are filling a very small requirement there, and we've opened 2 centres, which will basically aimed at children between 6 and 17. And it gives them the opportunity to learn digital and soft skills in a safe environment, and it basically fosters teamwork and collaboration. And we run various workshops, which kind of starts with computers and internet, and then that evolves into programming and robotics. So we've got these great little robots which basically assist programming.
Right.
And so they can program using kind of building blocks, and then that will transmit to commands to the robot. It's called an M-bot.
Okay.
And it's kind of a fun way of learning, and a fun way of learning something like programming.
It's one of those toys that I imagine it will have the effect of, particularly for a lot of these children who won't have seen technology that advanced before. What you're doing is you're opening their mind up to a possibility of what we can actually achieve as human beings in a positive way.
And even for us adults, when I remember seeing this little robotic device over a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, and it's something that we kind of developed, and for me, I was kind of like a kid in a candy store. I was like, wow, this is this is amazing. So I'm sure it has the same impact on the ground there. And then we're looking to evolve these workshops more into also electrical and also kind of fabrication type workshops as well. So we're trying to cover that, and that will kind of really give these children a chance of learning some real world skills in order to then have much better opportunities moving forward, because at the moment their opportunities are near zero.
That's it. And I think that's what makes the work so valuable that you guys do. Just in terms of what sort of lies ahead from yourself, from your own perspective personally, and TSF in future, is there anything we should be looking out for? I mean, do you see yourself staying doing this job a long time?
I love doing what I do for TSF. This year, I think, it has been very challenging, not only on the operational level, but also the funding level, because, we've seen all the industry events that I try and attend as many industry events as I can, and the face-to-face discussions are really important to the work that I do. So now that, obviously we've seen all these events move to virtual platforms, and they've done a great job. I mean, moving and adapting, and the virtual events have worked very well, but everyone will say it's not the same. You do need that kind of face-to-face interaction. So that's made kind of the funding element a lot more challenging.
Also, the fact companies are tightening their belts because of the whole impact economically of the pandemic.
Yeah, and I mean the only thing I would say, I mean, thankfully the telecom world actually hasn't been that negatively impacted by COVID compared to a lot of other industries. So there's no excuse not to give us lots of money. But no, you're right, because I think actually what happened and what I saw a year ago was the first 6 months of the pandemic was definitely more challenging, because I think companies were very busy trying to adapt to this new world. Even moving all their staff remotely and all the logistics behind that. So they were very busy figuring stuff out. But now actually I see that we're kind of normalized a little bit to this, and it's kind of business as usual. And I found in the latter part of last year, much more kind of meaningful conversations.
Well, that all sounds really positive. What should we look out for in the rest of 2021 from you guys? Any exciting projects coming?
Well, I think our focus is very much on Lab for Future and looking at other innovations. We're quite excited actually at the moment about the possible opportunity of using kind of low orbit satellite type services. And we've had a number of conversations, which I can't go into too much, but that for us is a technology that's really exciting, because it's cheaper, it's faster, and potentially quicker to deploy. And certainly in the developing economies that we generally work in, certainly when there's natural or man-made disasters, that type of equipment would be great.
That was the Tech for Good podcast. Listen, subscribe, and rate us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher.